Welcome to Grief and Spirituality, the experience of loss during extraordinary times. We are experiencing a global pandemic together, and today we will discuss ways to cope with grief and how it affects us spiritually. Framing the pandemic as grief. The five worst pandemics in recent history were HIV/AIDS pandemic, at its peak from 2005 2012, the death toll was 36 million. In the flu pandemic in 68, the death toll was 1 million. The Asian flu of 56 to 58, the death toll was 2 million. The pandemic 1918, the death toll was 20 to 50 million. Cholera pandemic 1910, 1911, the death toll was 800,000. The COVID-19 pandemic is one of the worst public health crises in a century, with the expected amount of deaths of several million worldwide, and an even bigger number of bereaved people left behind. Although the consequences of this crisis are still unknown, a significant number of bereaved people will arguably develop complicated grief in the aftermath of this emergency. If the current pandemic is unprecedented, the grief following the coronavirus outbreak is likely to share features with grief related to natural disasters. How does a pandemic create grief? As human beings, whenever our attachments are threatened, harmed, or severed, we naturally grieve. Grief is everything we think and feel inside of us when this happens. And there's a quote from Alan Wolfelt. During the pandemic, we experienced significant losses. Social contact was limited, created issues related to isolation. There were and still are interruptions in normal routines that created issues related to comfort and security. What was normal is or was no longer. We now have so many new normals. Family rituals were canceled or changed. Sunday family dinners have changed to internet meetings. Family visitation was and is restricted or limited. Holy Day celebrations were canceled. Those of Mardi Gras, Easter, Memorial Day, 4th of July. Life transition celebrations were postponed. Significant birthday parties, 80, 90, 100. Parties for grandchildren like Sweet 16. The weddings, imagine what the brides went through when they had to cancel their wedding or celebrate with limited guests. Spiritual and group community practice were canceled or restricted, such as community worship services in your home church, group Bible studies, midweek Lenten services, ritualized prayer, rosary, stations of the cross, First Friday devotions. We may have taken some of these rituals for granted. However, now, in ways both big and small, we grieve the loss of these rituals that gave us comfort, satisfaction, and socialization, security that all human beings need. The assumptive world. The assumptions or beliefs that ground, secure, or orient people, that give a sense of reality, meaning, or purpose to life. Better, 2005. There are two topics we want to focus on. One is change and its effect resulting in fatigue. All change is not growth, as all movement is not forward. Ellen Glasgow. In today's fast-paced world, change fatigue may be one of the most significant challenges we are faced with addressing. The causes of change fatigue vary and reflect the complexities of the economic, political, environmental, and social contexts, which impact us as individuals as well as members of a community. Change fatigue manifests itself in different ways for different people, and previous change experiences can impact how individuals react to new change situations. Constant change, like our facing today, and increased change fatigue. Change fatigue has been identified as being caused by the perception that too much change is taking place at one time. A main facet of human nature is people's inherent need for predictability and order. The second topic we want to focus on is death, as a constant reminder of our mortality. Intellectually, in our heads, we acknowledge our own mortality, but deep down, we tend to deny it. Death still tends to be a taboo subject in Western culture. Almost everything we do or don't do in life is designed to avoid consciously confronting the terrifying and terrible reality of mortality. I am talking culturally at the moment, not spiritually. We worship youth, health, and fitness. Even Freud admitted, "My own death is indeed unimaginable." He finally concluded no one believes in their own death. So, for some significant percentage of us, not only the sick, this currently incurable and sometimes fatal disease will be the ultimate focal point that shifts how we live our lives and how we deal with our death. It has already stripped us of control over the simplest activities in life: where we go, what we eat, and how we spend our day. A sobering and scary fact, indeed, this lack of complete control over our everyday living, not to mention our health and destiny. Being at the mercy of this vicious virus and of the sheer chance of contracting it is a source of deep anxiety for most of us. This imminent death is something we simply are not prepared to accept but no longer deny. The reality is that imminent death was present prior to the crisis and will continue to be a reality even after a treatment and vaccine become available. Eventually, we will learn to accept that. Learning to accept our own mortality will require psychological, social, and spiritual support, and it can be a freeing experience. The upheaval in our assumptive world. It doesn't have to keep us from functioning, working, creating, or to continue loving and living as fully and purposefully as we can in the present. Nor can we let it prevent us from taking on meaningful future projects. We must hold on to hope for our future. What types of emotions might we see? Feelings of guilt, anger, and anxiety may be intensified. Potential for complicated grief. Some may feel stuck and not move through the grief in a healthy progression. Possibility of mental health issues or substance abuse. Possibility of disenfranchised grief, when people don't feel acknowledged by others, or the possibility of ambiguous loss. Sudden loss is the inclination toward disbelief. Lack of mourning rituals and social support. Dying alone as conditions of care may be questioned. Tendency to develop alternative scenarios. Caregiving guilt and self-blame. Lack of closure. Inability to say goodbye. From a spiritual perspective, caregiver guilt can be increased when you are unable to visit, to keep vigil by our loved one's bedside, to be present at the time of death. We are unable to gather in grief and must find new ways to mourn. Dealing with loved ones dying in normal times can be difficult enough. But during this global health crisis, a host of new challenges arise as a physical distancing forces families apart during final bedside moments. Mourning in a pandemic is complicated, but it's important to do it. even if that means finding a new approach. Gathering to honor the lives of those we've lost is an essential piece of the grieving process. Rituals and structure provide a framework or a scaffolding over the intensely, emotionally, and disruptive experience that grief naturally is. Rituals and ceremonies give us a focus to honor the life of our loved one. They provide an outlet for the community to acknowledge our loss and to also pay their respects to our loved one's life. Given that many mourning rituals involved shared experiences, how do we mourn now that we can no longer gather? How do we create new rituals? The first step is to shift our focus away from what we can't do. We have to operate within the bounds of reality. It's not helpful to focus on what we can't do. If you can accept the reality of the current restrictions and be open to your own heart, that can facilitate creativity and innovation. And from that place, you can often see opportunities. Here are some of those options. Congregate virtually. Create new rituals for those who may not have access to online tools or prefer to keep their rituals offline. Create a common service or ritual. It doesn't have to be extravagant. Designate a time and activity and then invite others to recreate that common service wherever they are. Plan an in-person event for a later date. Seek support and give yourself permission to not just push through it. Give yourself permission to grieve in ways that your body is asking for, in ways that honor you. Give yourself grace, not guilt. Does the idea of trauma match the pandemic experience? How do we heal from a traumatic event? Trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident, a violent act, or a natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Most people will return to normal functioning after a difficult event. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. While these feelings are normal, some people have difficulty moving on with their lives. Reaction to trauma can start immediately or weeks, months, or even years after an event. We may see trauma responses from our bereaved families, our communities, healthcare workers, our loved ones, and ourselves. Now, let's review the factors for potential trauma. A rapid change from normal life to quarantine virus precautions. Social interactions and community supports sharply disrupted. And multiple losses in a short period of time. Sometimes it just takes time before individuals can truly understand how events impact them. Feelings of loss, trauma, and grief in our communities. Impact on future. Celebration of life. Events may exacerbate mental health issues for some individuals, escalate already existing anxiety disorders, as well as creating future emotional, mental concerns with survivors. Complicated grief. Grief that is complicated by adjustment disorders, especially depressed and anxious mood or disturbed emotions and behavior. Major depression, substance abuse, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Complicated grief is identified by the extended length of time of the symptoms, the interference in normal function caused by the symptoms, or by the intensity of the symptoms. For example, intense suicidal thoughts or acts, financial loss, mistrust of leaders, questioning the efficiency of decisions made, organizational trauma. Types of organizational trauma may include layoffs, major reorganizations, the turnover of senior leadership, or sudden loss of key talent. Community or collective grief. How will our communities recognize the losses we have experienced? Increased need for community supports. So, what type of first aid is available for our emotional self-care? Grief responds to awareness, attention, and expression. Alan Wolfelt. Awareness of emotions. Be aware of how you feel. Acceptance of your own emotions and accept what you cannot control. Connection with others, using the best way possible given the current situation. And self-kindness, give yourself grace. It's okay to not feel normal. Think of the word acts or access. And above all, we repeat, give yourself grace, not guilt. There are spiritual resources that are available. Spiritual resources are what gives a person hope, value, and self-worth. Spiritual resources give a person a sense of purpose and better days ahead. Believing there is a God who loves you and who has not forgotten about you and who will take care of you is a powerful resource. When you combine that with belief, the fellowship of like-minded people of faith, there is a sense of community that keeps you going even in the most difficult of times. Without spiritual resources, a person can lose hope and feel useless. Spiritual resources are the most important resource a person can have. Even a wealthy person without spirituality is poor and poorly equipped to deal with adversity. Spiritual support does not always have to be religious in nature in order to feed and sustain one's spirit. Spiritual practices and support can be in the form of scripture, religious readings, regular faith community attendance, prayer, meditation, spiritual religious rituals such as praying the rosary, morning, evening devotions, affiliation with your faith community through electronic newsletter, prayer groups or circles, family, TV and radio programming, listening to music, spending time outdoors in nature. Spiritual practices also includes anything that you are already doing that gives you a sense of hope, value, and self-worth. Let's conclude with a personal strength and resilience exercise. Ask yourself these 3 questions related as they relate to the current pandemic. What is something I learned? What is something that helped me cope? What is something I did that I'm proud of? You can use these questions anytime you experience a trauma or other difficult event to help you realize your strengths and resiliency. Thank you for participating in this presentation. I hope you found the information beneficial. I would like to leave you with one more quote, and we can read it together on this last slide. It is worth remembering that the time of greatest gain in terms of wisdom and inner strength is often that of greatest difficulty.